Welcome to this training video for CECs, Spiritual and Values-Based Orienting Systems, Anti-Bias, Humility, and Justice. This video will build knowledge and skills and offer practical strategies to invite all of us to bring an anti-bias approach, cultural humility, and a justice orientation to the realm of spiritual and values-based orienting systems, our own, our students, our colleagues, and those of our care recipients. The content for this video was developed by certified educators Amelia Catone, Joe Hirschman, Ben Eiton, Angel Lee, Unison Meadows, and Michelle Oberweis-Laycock. The learning objectives for this session are divided into three areas: knowledge, worldview and subjectivity, and application. With regard to knowledge, after viewing this video, learners will understand the breadth and depth of what the word culture encompasses, including the ways spiritual and values-based orienting systems overlap with race, culture, ethnicity, and other identities. Understand how CPE's roots in white Protestantism and the subsequent arrival of new groups in CPE have shaped our past and our present, and understand the intersections among racism, xenophobia, and religiously based oppressions. With regard to worldview and subjectivity, after viewing this video, learners will develop insights to connect more relationally, authentically, justly, and humbly with students, care recipients, and others, and expand their openness to learning from their students and patients as they continuously broaden their worldviews. With regard to application, after viewing this video, learners will develop tools for continuous self-assessment to gauge their own and their institutions' religious, spiritual, and values-based competence, and develop tools for educational approaches rooted in anti-bias, humility, and justice. We'll move through the following elements: a presentation on the histories and intersections of racism, xenophobia, and religiously based oppressions, a presentation on the ACPE's history looked at through the lens of religious, spiritual, and values-based belonging, a presentation on the transformational Indigenous praxis model, a presentation about language and CPE, and a presentation about an audit tool developed by the Religion and Values Task Force of the ACPE's Anti-Bias Work Group. We move now to a discussion about the histories and intersections of racism, xenophobia, and religiously based oppressions. We have two overarching learning goals: to understand the historical and contemporary intersections among racism, xenophobia, and religiously based oppressions, and to understand the breadth and depth of what the word culture encompasses, including the ways spiritual and values-based orienting systems overlap with race, culture, ethnicity, and other identities. This presentation draws on and synthesizes the work of a number of scholars. We're grateful to them for their groundbreaking work and for their commitment to equity, understanding, and justice. We draw heavily on the work of Kayati Joshi, whose book White Christian Privilege is an extremely important contribution to the field. We also consulted Anthea Butler's White Evangelical Racism to deepen our understanding of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. We are indebted to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz for her work on Indigenous peoples' histories in the US, and to Ibram Kendi for his work on racism in the US. The essay collection, Religion is Race, is a helpful resource for those seeking to understand the intersections among religion, race, and culture. TRUA is a social justice organization for Jewish clergy, and we used the organization's booklet, A Very Brief Guide to Anti-Semitism, as we worked on this presentation. Finally, Eric Ward is an organizer against white nationalism, and we consulted his essay, Skin in the Game, to deepen our understanding of the connection between white nationalism and anti-Semitism.
This presentation has several core themes. First, religion and race cannot be understood separately from each other. Second, for centuries in America, white racial superiority and Christian religious superiority have augmented and magnified each other. Third, religious and cultural identities are often interwoven. For example, when we think of Black Protestants or Serbian Orthodox Catholics, it's hard to separate out religion, race, ethnicity, and culture. In this context, it can be hard to parse out the differences between advantaged identities, example being Christian, and disadvantaged identities, example being a person of color. This means that, on one hand, Christians of color historically and currently experience racism and violence. For example, the Christianity of Christians of color can be the target of this racism, and we see this in violence against Black churches. On the other hand, Christians of color benefit from Christian privilege in ways that can be hard to see because of the weight of racism.
Turning now to definitions of Christian privilege, normativity, and hegemony, these three definitions form the core of Kayati Joshi's work in her book, White Christian Privilege. Christian privilege is manifested in the unearned privileges Christians receive and the corresponding disadvantages that religious minorities, atheists, and agnostics face on an everyday basis. Christian normativity refers to the notion that Christianity is normal and expected. Christian values are intrinsic to US national identity, and Christian language and metaphors and their underlying theology are the national standard. Christian hegemony is society's unacknowledged and unconscious adherence to a dominant worldview. Hegemonic ideologies are perpetuated through cultural norms, policies, and practices that set up those ideologies as business as usual. For example, in the US, there are multiple ways in which Christian observances, scriptures, beliefs, and manners of worship predominate and are endorsed, both implicitly and explicitly.
When we think about race and religion in the United States, it's important to understand gaps in perception among white evangelicals, which give rise to the idea that white Christianity is threatened or vulnerable. Wong and colleagues analyzed survey data gathered in 2017 from 10,000 plus US respondents on race, religion, and identity and found that white evangelicals are far more likely than all other religio-racial groups to believe white people face more discrimination than any other group, and they are less likely compared to all other groups to believe any group aside from themselves faces significant discrimination. Media focuses on cultural wars. White evangelicals focus on abortion and LGBTIQ rights, but this obscures the racism that is also at the heart of white evangelical political action.
To understand our current reality in the US, it's helpful to understand the global historical context through which we arrived here. We find the origins of the conceptual connection between religion and blood and the conflation of religion and race in 15th century Spain. The development of the concept of blood purity marked the beginning of the process of the racialization of religion. This is the process by which particular religions are associated with racial differences that come to be treated as absolute, fundamental, and heritable. The motivation for the notion of blood purity was the desire of Christian authorities to identify so-called crypto-Muslims and crypto-Jews, that is, the descendants of those who had converted to Christianity. In this way, Muslims and Jews were early categories of religious and racial others. As colonialism got underway, led by Spain and Portugal, which were Catholic countries, and Britain, a Protestant country, the goal was to quote-unquote convert and civilize. In this context, a so-called blood-based understanding of religion could be conflated with and reinforce racial dominion. And in 1492, a mass expulsion of Jews took place in Spain, with only 3 synagogues left today. A series of 15th century papal bulls or edicts granted the Portuguese monarchy the authority to seize West Africa. Any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be quote-unquote discovered and exploited. These edicts also permitted the enslavement of Muslims and other non-Christians. These papal bulls became the basis of European claims in the Americas and the United States westward expansion. In 1512, Pope Julius II issued a decree on the humanity of so-called Indians, stating that indigenous people in North America had souls and thus could be evangelized.
During the early European settlement of what would become the U.S., white Christian supremacy was developed, rationalized, and spread by philosophers, scientists, and theologians. At the time of the nation's founding, most universities were affiliated with the church. This connection amplified scientific theories of racial hierarchy and religious destiny, and rationalized land theft and slavery. The doctrine of manifest destiny provided racial and religious justifications for westward expansion into territories that had been Native Americans. The conquest and genocide of hundreds and millions of Native American tribes and millions of people was justified with ideological conflation of religion, civilization, and race. In this framework, Christianity, whiteness, and civilization were juxtaposed with so-called heathenism and lack of civilization. Mission schools and then boarding schools forced Protestant Christian values onto Native children and aimed to annihilate anything indigenous within the person. The federal government established in 1883 the Courts of Indian Offenses to prosecute Native Americans who participated in traditional ceremonies such as the Sundance. The court sought to restrict cultural identity of all American Indian tribes, with many political, cultural, and spiritual leaders being imprisoned. In 1884, the Religious Crimes Code banned traditional Native American religious practices. When enslaved Africans were brought to the United States, some were Muslim and others practiced African indigenous traditions. In the 1670s, white Christian missionaries arrived in plantation colonies with the goal of converting enslaved people to Christianity. They used the curse of Ham and 2 Adams readings of Genesis as religious justifications for slavery. According to the curse of Ham, people of African descent were children of Noah's son Ham, and their blackness was a result of Noah's curse of Ham. In the 2 Adams theory, Black and Native Americans people were descended from one Adam, and white people were from another Adam. The Black church developed in the 1780s as a spiritual, educational, and political arena of resistance against racism. One of America's grand narratives is that the nation was founded as a haven for those fleeing religious persecution, where everyone can worship freely and equally. In fact, the Puritans created a society where Protestant Christianity was the norm, and religious affiliation like race became a basis for exclusion and discrimination.
At the time of the founding of the US, white people were largely from Western and Northern Europe. This provided the definition of who was considered native. Nativism refers to a combination of xenophobia, fear or hatred of others, and ethnocentrism, a preference for one's own group. Nativism emerged in the mid-19th century when Jewish, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian immigrants began arriving in the US. In the same time period, Filipinos were entering New Orleans via the Caribbean, and Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and South Asian immigrants were arriving on the West Coast. Asian immigrants brought Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Shintoism, as well as syncretic and localized folk traditions. Asians were valued by white Americans as cheap labor and also demonized with tropes that wove together notions of foreignness, racial and cultural inferiority, and religious difference. Passed in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first time the US banned an entire group of people from immigrating on the basis of national origin. Meanwhile, two events shifted demographic and social power. First, the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48 resulted in the annexation of the land that now makes up the southwestern US. Second, African Americans were granted freedom and citizenship with the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments in 1865 and 1868. Between 1882 and 1924, there were more restrictions on immigration motivated by nativism and xenophobia. In 1917, the Barred Zone Act defined an Asiatic barred zone that represented about 1/5 of the world's land area. This act remained in effect until 1952. The Immigration Restriction League and the Ku Klux Klan added anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism to their agendas, resulting in restrictive immigration acts in 1921 and 1924 aimed at those from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act indexed immigration quotas to the number of Americans of that national origin in the 1890 census. For those of you thinking about the ACPE's history, CPE began in this same time frame in the 1920s. It wasn't until the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 that Asians, Africans, and Arabs could once again enter the US in large numbers. The ACPE was founded in 1967. We'll look more deeply at the ACPE's history in the next presentation.
We turn now to the ways in which Christian privilege is built into US law. To understand how this works, it's important to understand the distinction between belief and practice, and how this benefits Christians at the expense of adherents of other religions. Successive court rulings have denied the distinction between belief and action. We can see this in the free exercise rulings that span several centuries. The Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment protects the right to practice religion. In practice, though, it was not protected the rights of religious minorities. For example, in Reynolds versus U.S. in 1870, George Reynolds, a Mormon, said an 1862 ban on polygamy violated the Free Exercise Clause. But the Supreme Court ruled that polygamy was an action, not a belief. Reynolds could believe in polygamy, but not engage in it. Almost a century later, in 1986, in Goldman versus Weinberger, a Jewish U.S. Air Force officer wanted to wear a kippah while on duty. The Supreme Court, however, said that wearing a kippah is a personal preference, not a religious obligation. Several years later, Congress passed legislation permitting religious head coverings. However, after this, Sikhs had to fight anew for the right to wear uncut hair and beards and turbans while engaging in military service. In other examples, in 1990, the Supreme Court restricted the religious use of peyote by Native Americans. In 1993, the signing of Religious Freedom Act. However, in the same year, the court banned the Santeria religious practice of sacrificing small animals. It wasn't until 1994 that Native Americans have full religious freedom. In all of these cases, Christianity was the religion to which other groups practices.
For the final piece of this presentation, we'll look at Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as two contemporary examples of the racialization of religion. As a reminder, when we talk about the racialization of religion, we're talking about the conflation of religion with racial difference. In the context of the oil crisis of 1973, the Iran hostage crisis of 1979, the Gulf War, and the post-9/11 war on terror, the US sometimes explains its quote-unquote enemies ideology in terms of their interpretations of Islam. Post 9/11, we saw an intensification of the racialization of Islam. The words Arab and Muslim are often used interchangeably and sometimes as code words for terrorist. South Asian, North African, and Middle Eastern people are all assumed to be Muslim, despite the great variety of religious practices in these regions. The so-called war on terror has been described as a crusade, a word with Christian connotations, and the purported conflict between the US and Muslim countries or individuals is sometimes called a clash of civilizations. We see Islamophobia in the quote-unquote birtherism of the 2008 election cycle and in Donald Trump's presidential campaigns, and we see the institutionalization of Islamophobia in President Trump's so-called Muslim ban. In all of these examples, race, or a constructed idea of a distinct racial group, and religion, in this case Islam, are both demonized in deeply harmful ways. Anti-Semitism is an ideology that regards Jews as a corrupting presence within society. Anti-Semitism originated in antiquity as anti-Judaism and has evolved into a modern political ideology that blurs race and religion. Anti-Semitism draws on a pool of stories and tropes about Jews that get pulled to the surface at different times and for different reasons. Eric Ward, an African-American organizer against white nationalism, describes anti-Semitism as an animating force of white nationalism. In this framework, Jews are regarded as a nefarious, sinister force behind Black political and cultural power, and therefore are the driving force of so-called white dispossession. Remember, we spoke earlier about how the most politically conservative white people in the US believe themselves to experience more racism than any other group. White nationalists regard Jews as a race of their own, arguing that although Jews are often read as white, they cannot actually assimilate into whiteness because they are too fundamentally different from Christians. Again, a constructed idea of race, that Jews form a distinct race, and religion, in this case Judaism, are demonized in harmful ways. In this presentation, we've talked about the overlaps among racism, xenophobia, and religiously based oppressions. Here are some questions for ongoing consideration. In your setting, where do you see intersections among racism, xenophobia, and religiously based oppressions? And how do you see identities related to culture, race, spiritual orienting system, ethnicity, and immigration experiences overlapping and shaping each other in your own life, in the lives of those whom you serve, and in your students' lives?
We have provided information about the historical and contemporary context in which the ACPE came into being and continues to do its work. We'll turn now to this history. Our guiding question for this section is, how did CPE begin, and how did that shape what ACPE became and is still becoming?
CPE grew out of a number of influences in the late 19th century and early 20th century. In New England, Protestant leaders wanted to provide ministers with rigorous, practical, and standardized training in pastoral care. At the same time, members of Boston medical psychotherapy movement sought to treat everyday conditions such as alienation and depression, not just severe pathology. It was sympathetic to unifying psychology and religion and spirituality. Both movements were comprised of almost entirely white Protestant Christian men.
In 1925, CPE began with Anton Boysen at Worcester State Hospital, a psychiatric hospital. The trainees were white Protestant Christian men providing what was called parish hospital visitations. Most patients at Worcester State Hospital were working class. Wealthier patients could choose the private McLean Asylum in Boston or be cared for at home. While women and men were represented equally in the patient population, women tended to recover and obtain release more quickly. African Americans were underrepresented in the hospital population relative to their numbers in the state, possibly reflecting racism in the allocation of public resources. Black and white patients were placed in separate wards. Hospital Superintendent Dr. Samuel B. Woodward believed that Irish immigrants drove themselves insane by quote-unquote indulgence of stimulating drink, and that they were less likely to recover from mental illness than their native-born counterparts.
Anton Boysen understood CPE within the larger work of Christianity. As it grew, a variety of faith traditions and institutions expanded CPE. In 1967, all these four groups came together as one larger organization called the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. Boysen's mindset continued to still be influencing the organization with the focus to call attention back to the central task of the church, that is, of saving souls, and to the central problem of theology, which is sin and salvation. Given that CPE remained a largely Christian, specifically mainline Protestant movement until the 1980s, whose voices and perspectives were left out of this model?
Since the 1980s, much has changed in CPE. CPE's tent is now filled with students, educators, and CEC who are from evangelical and Pentecostal communities, who are Catholic, Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Seventh-day Adventist, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, humanist, secular, practitioners of African diaspora religions, pagan and Wiccan traditions, Sikh and Native American traditions, and those with dual and multiple belongings, to offer an incomplete list. Mary Watkins offers two frameworks to think about this kind of change: an ameliorative approach, in which we add onto what is already there, and a transformative approach, in which is an ontological shift where we fundamentally change what was originally there. Thinking about CPE in the past and today, which approach or approaches do you think are needed? When and why?
We turn now to another way of thinking about change and practice, Piwawardi's transformational Indigenous praxis model.
The transformative Indigenous praxis model is one way that educators can self-supervise around the inclusive and transformative nature of their curriculum and teaching methods, rooted in justice seeking and awareness of bias. This is just one example that is based off of James Banks's multicultural education model. If you as an educator have an existing or alternative framework that helps to foster accountability and transformative education practices, use that or combine it with this one.
In the first stage of the TIPM, educators add to an existing curriculum that already centers dominant voices. This might look like having standalone sessions from the 826 video series without infusing other educational methods with justice seeking and awareness of bias. Another example could be extracting portions of a culture or religious traditions, such as quote unquote food and festivities, heroes and holidays, end quote, without including genuine representation from or context for that culture or tradition. In a way, everyone has to start somewhere, and many educators often start here.
In the additive stage, educators become aware of the need to learn more specifics about particular tribes, nations, traditions, and perspectives. By adding to the curriculum a book to read, a movie to watch with some discussion afterwards, this is one way to do this. This is evidence of making good progress with a beginning understanding of what it means to be colonized. This realization may bring about grief or guilt, which is a natural part of the process. This is a good stage to invite deeper self-reflection and incorporate the curriculum audit, which we'll be looking at a little bit later in this video.
The transformation phase marks a significant shift in the educator's mindset and how they engage the curriculum. Beyond additions, learning is infused with a deeper awareness and understanding of what it means to decolonize their practice. Dominant voices are decentered, and relational practices take the place of transactional exchanges. One way this could be done is through an immersion experience in indigenous and non-dominant worldviews. Deeper interpersonal relationships can develop from immersion experiences, which forms a foundation for the next stage of TIPM.
In cultural and social justice action stage, relationality is centered as the main educational priority. Beyond communicating information about decolonization practices, the group is actively engaged in decolonizing both the educational process and the systems in which they serve and operate. Decolonization is a present, ongoing reality that requires changes in life action, risk, and effort. We have heard some educators lament that no matter what they do to change their curriculum so that it is more genuinely inclusive, it still never feels like enough. We like to reframe this feeling of insufficiency to support educators in making a lifelong commitment to learning, growing, and transforming. This work is not stagnant. It is oriented towards beginning to heal trauma, restore identity, and humanity.
And as these transformations happen, resistance is bound to come up. Resistance from within the educator themselves, from the students, from within the systems, and from the contexts in which they serve. And the greater the change, the greater the resistance. This wave jumping diagram is a natural metaphor for how change is made within individuals and systems incrementally and over time.
Through a metaphor of wave jumping, educators working to decolonize their practice can gain forward momentum with time and energy, even when facing resistance. Thus, as water is always in motion, so are efforts towards decolonization. This is not a linear model of upward progression, but rather cyclical and fluid as we navigate ever-changing conditions of our social context.
The model provides a scaffolding process to promote critical thinking and working through power hierarchies brought about through colonized practices based on individuals, cultures, and institutional structures.
These commitments will begin inside each one of us as personal change. However, transformation toward decolonization will become a reality only when we collectively commit to a movement based on an ethical and political vision and consciously reject the colonial postures of weak submission, victimhood, and raging violence.
This transformation, occurring over time, requires long-term commitment to the work with individual and collective efforts to make change in ways of knowing and being in concrete practice.
Before we can engage with the steps of the transformative Indigenous praxis model, we must self-assess about where we are. Use the audit form provided as a resource as part of this video presentation. Dialogue and consultation with peers and the local populations from whom you wish to learn.
Begin by addressing your own implicit biases and assumptions. Who is your close circle of friends and support? Whose circles are you in? Who are your neighbors? Where do you live? Where do you shop? Who are your medical providers? What does your spiritual community look like? How often do you participate in communities outside of your own? Renew your commitment for self and program assessment regularly and begin to make incremental changes based on the feedback. We'll now transition to the next portion of the video in which Angel Lee will discuss the importance of language and how words can shape, change reality.
Greetings. My name is Angel Lee, and I identify as a Black cisgender Christian woman who lives and works in the southeastern region of the United States of America. Naming my identity and location is important, for it impacts how I understand language and how I am impacted by language. This may certainly be the case for you and your students. Social location influences our understanding of words and how we use them. Social location also influences the impact of words. I would like us to take a moment to listen to Toni Morrison, who is a Nobel Prize-winning writer and author. Listen to her speak about a childhood experience when she learned the power of words.
My sister taught me to read when I was 3. And we used to get down on our knees on the sidewalk with a pebble and write, cat, dog, I hate you, or I hat you, because we didn't know the E. One day, we noticed another word down the street about half a block away, and we decided to write it. So we got together, expanding our vocabulary. We wrote F, and then looked over there, U, and we were just getting ready to do the C when my mother ran out of the house and started screaming, "What's the matter with you?" She's furious. "You, go get a bucket of water. You, go get a broom." And we were crying because we don't know what happened. We have to get rid of the words. And she doesn't say the word. She doesn't say what it is. She never does in my entire life. I don't know how old I was before I found out what it meant. And she never tells us what it's about. But ultimately, I knew that words have power. Words can do that to my mother, a word I don't even know. Now that is power.
The video clip that you just watched is from the Netflix documentary on Toni Morrison titled Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am. I encourage you to watch the documentary. You may have your own story of realizing the power of words. Maybe there was something that you said that caused an unexpected emotional response. Maybe there was something that you said that caused someone to remember a particular experience. Maybe there was something that you said that caused someone to take action. Words have power to recall stories, elicit emotion, and manipulate or persuade. If you do not remember anything else from my presentation, remember that your intention does not always equal impact. Again, intention does not equal impact. Diversity and inclusion is a value of ACPE. Some organizations with the same value have sought to execute this value with creating equity language guides. George Packer, who is a journalist for The New Yorker and The Atlantic, researched equity language guides for several organizations: the American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, University of Washington, Columbia University School of Professional Studies, and American Medical Association are some of the organizations with equity language guides. George Packer discovered that these guides sought to cleanse the language of any trace of privilege, hierarchy, bias, or exclusion. Yet these guides have been created by people who are making the determination what words or phrase should or should not be used. The chosen words and phrases did not emerge from shifting linguistic habits of the people whom the organizations were trying to include. Here I offer some examples of banned words and phrases and their replacements. George Packer also discovered in his research that these guides largely agreed with each other on language since they referred to the same sources, yet there was some conflict. For example, the American Cancer Society prefers marginalized over under-resourced or underserved. The National Recreation and Parks Association says that marginalized has a negative connotation and should only be used in certain contexts, but never as an adjective. George Packer states that, and quote, "The total number of people behind this project of linguistic purification is relatively small, but their power is potentially immense. The new language already influences institutions of higher education and leading nonprofits." I listed the term Black as banned and people of color as the replacement. The American Heart Association, among other institutions, preferred the phrase people of color. Although these organizations haven't technically banned the term Black, I experience Black as a term that's slowly being banned in our society as people of color become more prevalent. People of color is a general term to include anyone who does not identify as white. As a Black woman, I experience this change of language as refusing to see me, the plight of my ancestors, and the culture of the Black community. Although the intent of these guides are to create language that is inclusive, the impact of the language preferred in these guides can be exclusive and shaming. For example, the Sierra Club prefers the phrase "protect our rights" over "stand up for our rights." These phrases have two different meanings for me. In order to protect rights, I have to have the rights to protect. As a Black woman in this country, there are rights that I deserve, such as equal pay, with my male counterparts, and such as the right to wear my hair in its natural texture without discrimination. I can't protect what I don't have, but I can fight for the rights that I deserve. The problem with these guys is that they create what they are intending to remove. A power dynamic is inherent based on those who create the preferred language and enforce the language within institutions. The new language does not include experiences and preferences of the people. In fact, it seeks to soften hardship and oppression and make experiences sound more palatable and less harmful. George Packer says, as stated on the slide, equity language doesn't fool anyone who lives with real inflictions. It's meant to spare only the feelings of those who use it. What do we do? ACPE also has values of integrity, curiosity, process, and service. As ACPE members and educators, we desire to listen to others, be curious, and be attentive. At the end of the day, we are all human beings with values, beliefs, feelings, and experiences. When using language to refer to a group of people, think about what it means to be human. Avoid using language that are tied to your own culture and values. For example, theology is a common word in our organization, but it excludes educators and students who do not ascribe to a theology. With integrity and cultural humility, I acknowledge that I have a theological stance, and I would like to know what values inform your work in spiritual care. I refuse to prescribe a word or a phrase as a solution to theology. Instead, I encourage you to stay curious, to listen, and to learn from others, your students, your peers. I grew up in a culture that prefers the word homegoing to funeral. We celebrate the life of someone before we bury them in a homegoing service. We believe their spirit is at home. Learning this about my culture is a result of listening to me or others who have experiences that may not feel like yours or may not be yours. So use the language that is meaningful to your student or the people you are engaging. Make space in your language for your students to feel seen, heard, and valued by you. Getting started in adjusting your language may be hard. The Religion and Values Task Force of the ACPE Anti-Bias Work Group has developed an audit tool to help you in this process.
Do you collect students' demographic data? If so, do you have a way to account for multiple belongings? If you already do this, or if you want to begin doing this, here are some questions to consider. Which identities and belongings do you include, or would you include? Would you make it possible for people to check off multiple identities and belongings? Would you include a free text option? Have you ever learned that your students were hiding parts of their identities from you or from their peers?
Consider using a self-report Likert scale to rate your familiarity with the beliefs and practices associated with the following practices, belief systems, and communities. We have a list here. I invite you to take a moment to look at it. And there are more traditions and communities listed here. Again, I invite you to take a minute to read through this.
If you were to pick several areas on which to focus your own growth and development in the coming year, which areas would you choose? How would you hold yourself accountable to doing this work?
Do the following words appear in your written materials? Example, in verbatim formats, final evaluation questions, templates for learning goals, outreach and publicity materials. So the words are ministry, theology, pastoral care. If these words appear, do you offer alternatives?
Thinking about academic preparation for residencies, do you expect incoming residents to have an MDiv? And what is your process, if any, around equivalencies?
Take an inventory of your didactics. What topics are included? Are there opportunities to diversify your didactics and the people who teach them? Do you teach your students about minority religious traditions? Who teaches these didactics? What are their backgrounds and areas of expertise?
In your anti-oppression work and teaching, do you talk about Christocentrism, Christian hegemony, and the connections between white Christianity and racism?
What services or rituals, if any, do you ask or expect your students to lead? How do you handle requests for time off for religious or cultural holidays, for Shabbat, and for prayer? In your department and or your classroom, if you use centerings, gatherings, or prayer, what do these look like? What spoken or unspoken, written or unwritten policies do you have about clerical attire, religious garb, and tattoos and piercings?
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We hope it'll be helpful to you in your work and learning. And thank you for all of the amazing work that you do with students and with care recipients. In closing, how will you use what you have learned in this presentation in your ongoing work with students? If you have questions or feedback about anything in this video, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Religion and Values Task Force of the Anti-Bias Work Group of the ACPE. And again, thank you.